Hello everyone. Abohar Urban Studio welcomes you all to our first talk in the series of small cities informing urban theory. This Shehar Conversation series will explore the different facets of life in small towns of India. The speakers will cover aspects of urban growth, physical and cultural transformation of these cities, aspirations of the youth, and governance aspects and issues of social and segregation of different communities in the city. Our first speaker, Mukta Naik, is an architect and urban planner and a fellow at Center for Policy Research. Her research interests include housing and urban, urban informality, and internal migration, as well as urban transformations in cities. At CPR, she focuses on understanding the link between internal migration and urbanization in the Indian context. Naik is a graduate of the School of Planning and Architecture and has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Texas A&M University. She is currently pursuing a PhD in urban development and governance from the from the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, Erasmus University. Mukta is one of the two leads at the Small City Dreaming Research Project, which examines the way small cities shape the employment outcomes of migrant youth in India and Indonesia, the two largest democracies in the developing world. Today, she is going to share her work from the small cities of Kishangarh and Mangalore. Now, I would invite Mukta to take over.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's my particular privilege to kick off this series that sounds really exciting and will be an opportunity to hear many people whose work I've been following but haven't had the chance to keep up with. So I'll start right away. I have a presentation to go along, but basically I look at the question of small cities from the lens of migration and mobility. And in this particular project, I'm looking at youth. And of course, the project started with a very economic geography framing or an economic framing of demographic dividend and youth and, those kind of issues. But as I went along, and that's what the Small City Dreaming Project was really about. But as I went along in my PhD journey, I started thinking a lot more about what place has to do with aspiration and what kind of mobilities are possible or not possible for different kinds of people, basis their identity, basis their circumstances. So it's got much deeper into the qualitative aspects of the research. The study itself had both survey, quantitative data collected, as well as a lot of focus group discussions and interviews. And also, since we collected data over a 3-year period, we were also able to sort of follow some people over a 6-month, 8-month time period. And that's a lot in the life of a young person who's 18 or 19 and, taking a lot of important decisions which will affect their futures. So I'll share now, and I hope you enjoy this as much as I have enjoyed putting it together today. So these are some articulations we heard, when we were doing our research. So there were girls who asked us, why is freedom always conditional for us? Why is it that we can't get the freedoms that we want if we really think we need them to progress in life? People talked about their caste and how it was a limiting factor, whether they were men or women. People talked about the city as only a source of income, whereas they felt that the village offers them, really offers them the quality of life that they need. So contrary to the city being framed as a place of emancipation, as a place of freedom, as a place of, where you can give up a certain identity characteristics and do whatever you want, we were hearing very contradictory accounts of from what urban theory had been talking about urbanization and especially metropolitan cities or global cities as. And that's what started, we started the project thinking of small city economies, but then as we went along, we also started thinking about small city societies and, how these things actually all came together in the lives of young people. And I won't dwell too much on these narratives because they'll come back to them a little bit later. But theoretically, I sort of am building some of this work around the notion of mobile aspirations, and this space, it's very simple construct where we understand that youth actually construct their future aspirations, whether they're related to work, education, marriage, how they're going to, what lifestyle they're going to have, through desires for mobility. They're talking about moving, they're talking about not moving, they're talking about moving for some time till they reach a certain goal and then moving elsewhere. But movement and mobility is a very strong theme the world over among young people. But we know that these mobilities are not evenly experienced. There are many social structures that inhibit these mobilities, and those who are socially marginalized have less agency over mobility. They can't. And it can work both ways. So, for instance, a refugee would be forced to leave. So there is no choice in whether they can stay back or leave. They feel like they have to leave. On the other hand, somebody who wants to go, like a woman who wants to go and study in another city, a young woman may not get those permissions, and so they may have to forego those aspirations for mobility. And of course, aspirations themselves also change across place, time, and culture. So this is very, very strong a framing of how aspirations and mobility are connected. And in this, there is a whole literature around mobilities, which is emerging from the migration literature, where scholars started. A lot of the migration literature globally is, about international migrations and borders and ethnocentric sort of notions of how people who are insiders and outsiders, people who belong and people who don't belong. And the new mobilities literature started sort of dismantling these kind of binaries and talking about how people, ideas, and technologies are in constant movement and interaction with each other. I found this attractive because I study internal migration. And if we're trying to locate the work that I'm doing in the context of migration literature, there's always this pushback saying, but you're talking about movement within a country, and that's not the same thing because people are free to move within the country. But actually, and Anu would probably agree with me, internal migrants also face many, many barriers, and not just barriers of, political barriers like you can't vote here or people don't like you or people suspect you, but also actual barriers of what your identity actually allows you to access in terms of rights and entitlements, etc., in the place that you've moved to. And there are lots of nuances about whether who you are in terms of your caste, class, gender, etc., and how you're able to negotiate the state and the market. I was also very attracted by the notion of complex migration, where we are able to then tie up what we've been talking about in India in terms of circular seasonal migration patterns to things that are being talked about in the rest of the world too, like in the height of the immigration crisis in Europe in 2015-16, there was a lot of work around how migration itself is a incomplete process and how borders and they actually inhibit the settling of people, and how there's a whole bunch of people who's constantly moving back and forth in search of work and opportunity. So this is the second pillar of how I link my work to migration literature. And then there's the question of the small city. So when I started, when we were doing this project, CPR where I work was already deeply embroiled in this large project called Subaltern Urbanization, out of which a book and multiple sort of articles have now emerged, where they were talking specifically about smaller cities in India and the Indian context, where urban growth was not coming from the largest cities, but actually coming in a very dispersed manner, and where many smaller cities were also autonomous, exciting, vibrant, economically viable, or offering, at least capable of offering opportunities. And how also urbanization was growing out of an in situ urbanization of rural areas and not just a product of migration. So there are all of these ideas about how cities are being made and reshaped that are happening, which is turning the discourse away from the Bombays and Delhis and Hyderabad's of the world to smaller and smaller and smaller settlements, to really understand what problems they face and what contributions they make. And I was also fascinated by the idea of that small cities are sort of in this in-between space, this middle ground, where they're neither the village, which has been theorized in specific ways, especially in India, in terms of the caste narrative. It's really seen as backward, and where cities are assumed to be large, bustling spaces which offer anonymity and certain kinds of opportunities. And here there was this idea of what do small cities do? Are they the middle ground? And what does that really mean in the lives of people? So I'm going to keep this presentation extremely empirical and sort of very touchy feely, because I think it really helps people understand what I'm talking about. I decided to pick two case studies, Kishangarh and Mangalore. As you can see, they are not the same category in terms of size. There's one in the north, one in the south. And so, yes, in a sense, I was using a dissimilar case study approach here, where I was trying to look at a city in the north and the south, because I wanted to explore a little bit questions of gender, and felt that having that kind of difference, this is coming more from the regional patriarchies kind of literature, would help me, understand what gender really, I mean, how gendered experiences change across different kinds of spaces. But also this, I took a sort of a scalar approach here. So Mangalore is a district, is sort of the district headquarter. It's a much more urbanized district. It's close to Kerala, so it's industrial. It's been an industrial town, a port city for a very long time. So certain kinds of images of cosmopolitanism, modernity that it evokes, but has not really grown in population. It has no explosive growth in population going on there. It sort of had that 500,000 mark, plus and minus, for a while. Whereas Kishangarh is in Ajmer district, it's in Rajasthan. It's a much smaller city. It's not a district headquarter. It's an industrial town where the industry is also fairly recent, and it's now emerging into a logistics hub because it's on the dedicated freight corridor, which is part of the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor project. So these are cities where the state has had a very different role to play over history in the formation of these cities. They're very different labor markets. Mangalore is much more service oriented. It's moving from an industrial to a service orientation, whereas Kishangarh used to be a market town, a mandi town, and has now become a center of industry. So these dissimilar contexts were very exciting for me to look at. Like I won't repeat too much of this, but this is just to give context on a little more on Kishangarh, where what really attracted us when we selected it, and the selection process actually used 2001 migration census data. When we were starting our project, the 2011 migration data tables were not out yet, but we actually looked at districts that had both in migration and out migration. So that places we were already thinking about identifying cities where multiple kind of mobilities would be experienced. And I mean, to cut a long story short, we applied a series of filters and narrowed down certain districts. And then within them, we tried to study cities where there was a significant migrant population. What distinguishes Kishangarh really is that the marble industry here, it's basically marble processing. It's nothing very high tech. It's just marble cutters, very labor intensive. But the raw marble comes from places like Italy and Turkey and all sorts of other places in the world, and then gets cut and finished and then sent out for domestic as well as export sort of uses. So there's that global sort of positioning of a city that is actually a very small town with not much going on there, by way of, if you think about cities, it's not a very vibrant urban center as such. And of course, on the governance side, it's a Nagar Panchayat. There's a very strong presence of the industrial corporation. Very strong presence of elites, it's like an RK Marble city. Everywhere you go, you'll see RK Marble, the college, the school, the this, the that, everything is branded. So the local elites and the Marble Manufacturers Association have a big role to play in governance. So that's sort of the political economy that we are looking at here. That's the location. If you in relation to Jaipur, that's where you have Kishangarh, and sort of it's quite close to Ajmer, which has also a religious and tourist sort of attraction. In fact, the airport in this region is also in Kishangarh, so it's really become like a place where a lot of investment has got pulled in recently. And Mangalore is a very different city, like I explained, very entrepreneurial in terms of its culture, very conservative. If you Google Mangalore, you're likely to see, sort of that everyday life is actually has this pall of violence because there's a lot of Hindu-Muslim tensions there. There's a lot of conservatism around, how social relations, gender relations. At the same time, it's a city full of students, and a lot of education centers there. So it's a strange mix of things that's happening and makes the lives of young people in this city quite contradictory at times. And that's where it's located. So as you can see, it's sort of quite close to the Kerala border. This is the Kerala border, so it's literally 15 kilometers from Kerala, which also means that the long trend of out migration from here, not just to other cities in India, but also to the Middle East and other places, has also been a mobility feature of this region. So this is just a snapshot of our data to show, there's this sort of understanding that smaller cities attract migrants from the region. But as you can see in Kishangarh, when it's a manufacturing center, things are slightly different. They do attract labor from as far as Bihar, UP, especially Bihar, UP, because these are sending regions to industry all across India. So this economic geography of India, which is this sort of, north-south kind of a divide where UP, Bihar and the poorer states in the north and east are actually labor sending regions everywhere, plays up very strongly in this slide. However, because Mangalore is more diverse, it's larger, you can see that the catchment areas are also much more diverse. So I guess, the story in Kishangarh is that of very specific caste-based social networks from which migrants emerge. And the story of Mangalore is a lot more diverse in the sense of how do migrants get to Mangalore? And it's a much more diverse and a much more nuanced story there. So what we found really, or what we really got from, and as an aggregate in terms of thinking of these cities, was this business of the small city being actually at the cusp of different kinds of mobilities. So one thing we saw clearly was that people were coming from small towns or villages in the vicinity to these cities, working for several years, but then returning. So not really focusing on buying a house or establishing themselves in any way, but going back to the village at the end of a few years of work. So that was one sort of a pattern that we saw. If you change the temporality, you saw commuting. This could be daily commuting. This could be weekly commuting. So again, a similar pattern of moving from the village to the cities and then moving back into the village or the small town. So there's not a lot, you're not moving beyond the sphere of the relationship between wherever you belonged and the small city. Then the second pattern that we saw was the step migration pattern, where you saw people coming into these cities to study, to get their first jobs, to sort of get the initial labor market experiences, pick up skills, pick up confidence, and then move into other kinds of cities. And this could be larger cities, metropolitan cities, or cities just larger than them, or even similar kinds of cities. And then there was this business of replacement migration, which Professor Irudhaya Rajan always talks about in the context of Kerala, where he talks about how labor goes from Kerala to the Gulf, and then Kerala needs labor from other parts of, especially eastern parts of India. And we really see the small city do a lot of that, where elite youth leave. They don't see a future for themselves in these cities. They have the means to go out, and so they go out at the stage of education itself, elsewhere to study. It could be the state capital, it could be a district headquarter, and then move on, perhaps. And an in-migration comes in to avail the opportunities in the city itself. So in terms of, because these are, in terms of population sizes, not exactly comparable cities, I use the Schiller and Kaglar sort of locality and scale, city scale logics to position these cities as low scale cities, where, they are weak in terms of governance, they're often dependent on dominant industries, and they offer opportunities for migrants, but these opportunities are weak and selective rather than sort of moving towards a situation where migrants can come in and get incorporated and get sort of embedded into the city in a more long-term way. So these are, so it's a much more tentative sort of a migration into this city. It's much more of a struggle than one imagines. Why would young people go somewhere if they know there's so much struggle involved? And that's really the point where the characteristic of youth, one of the characteristics of youth is this constant mobility or aspiration for mobility or negotiating mobility. And small cities have very specific sort of experiences. They offer very specific kind of experiences. We published the work which sort of talked about small cities as migration junctions, using all our 4 case cities in India as well as in Indonesia in this report, which is available on our website. It's more of a policy thought piece on what can you do when you have these junction kind of places. Can you enable them to be footholds for people to migrate further into to other locations where there are more opportunities? Can you use them to strengthen? So there's been a long conversation about how small cities are useful for rural development purposes. So can that be a way to think about it? But I won't elaborate on that because that's a whole different conversation, which is a very policy focused conversation. So I'll take you through some sort of themes that we got from the interviews. What are the outcomes and experiences of youth in this context of aspirational mobility in these case cities of mine? The first is, of course, identity is really important. It works as a barrier. It also works as an enabler. And the nature of the city, what economic offerings it has, what kind of other enabling factors it might have is also a very major part of this. So these are just stories. So I just tell one story on one slide. So there is this business of mobilities can sometimes be used very strategically by young people to unlock certain kinds of possibilities. So that's Snehal's story. She's from a rich business family in Kishangarh, and where there's a lot of pressure that girls must marry as per family expectations. So what she does is she tells her, and her father says, you can't really go outside to study because you need to marry the way we into the family that we decide for you. So she strikes a deal with her father saying, I want to go and study in Delhi, and when I come back, or even if you find someone for me to marry right in the middle, I promise I will not argue. I will come back the day. I will basically drop everything and do your bidding. Knowing very well that that's highly unlikely. If the father has enrolled her in a master's course in Delhi, she's probably not going to get called back halfway. Then she leverages this experience of living in a hostel, in a PG in Delhi, to actually gain entry into a new PG business that's being set up in Kishangarh, which is now getting its first girls' college. And she positions herself as someone who's had this experience of living in a PG and therefore can sort of pushes into a domain of men within her family into an entrepreneurial domain. And this is a novelty. And she tells this story the way I'm telling it. She talks about how one has to be selfish to get what one wants. And so the focus really here, and you see this in all our stories of women, all the stories of women here, the focus is really on intra-household negotiations. So you use your mobility to prove that you can remain respectable, even though you have experienced freedom, and that you have a sense of responsibility in utilizing the freedoms that your family is giving you, and therefore they can trust you to do more and more and more, and that's how you push yourself forward into the labor market and into other opportunities. But it's also conditional. This is also a story of women, but these women are in a village called Potri, an hour outside Kishangarh, and here Lata has to commute every day to Kishangarh to the degree college, where there is a lot of vigilance on her movements by the family, where the village is constantly exerting pressure on her parents to say, why are you spending so much? Why are you taking the risk of this girl using public transport and going all the way to the city to get a college degree that's not going to give her anything. It's not like she's going to work. It's not like like her future in-laws are going to allow her to work. So, but this is sort of the negotiation. And again, there's a lot of virtue signaling, they have to do in order to just have this freedom of going to college. Rima's story she's very strident in her articulations, and she's very bright, and she's married to a young man who is sitting at the time of our interview for the public school teacher positions. He's applying for government jobs basically, and she struck a deal with her with her husband at 18 in the presence of her father, who is an NGO worker, and she teaches at the local NGO school. And she's basically said, I'm giving you 1 year to do these exams, and I'm going to work in the local NGO school and bring in some salary. But after that 1 year, whether you get in or whether you don't get in, you have to let me go to college. So she's taking a gap year between grade 12 and college in a negotiated settlement with her in-laws family. This is also intra-household negotiation, but very with very clear purpose that getting that education and being able to move freely is something that she has a right to, and that she will put herself out to achieve. Then there's the question of caste as boundary. And here, this is also a Kishangarh story where Rakesh has a postgraduate degree, but he doesn't have the networks and resources to migrate to a Jaipur or an Udaipur or a Delhi. And also there are these stories, he goes, he visits, he tries, he comes back, because people from his caste who have migrated before to the state capital have faced discrimination, and the risk is very high to take. So basically, he is stuck in sanitation work in Kishangarh, which is, certainly not commensurate with the kind of education that he's managed to get for himself. So there's a caste issue that sort of a pall over his life. And the interesting contrast here is, as compared to people like Snehal, whose families are constantly monitoring the movement of their women within the city, while Valmiki women in Kishangarh are working, are sanitation workers. Many of them have government jobs, others have jobs with contractors, which sort of which sort of draws attention to Bell Hooks' famous description of how Black women in the US did not have the privilege of staying in the private. So we see these sort of similarities across context also of the gendered experience. Then there is the social network story, where connections are key. So we have Vivek, who grows up in a village near Kishangarh. He loses his father as a teenager, moves to the city to live with relatives, and he's a Jain, which is a very affluent business community in the city. He comes from a poor family, but because he is part of this biradari, there is support in terms of accommodation, in terms of working capital, seed capital to set up a business, lower rents, references of customers, and he works himself up to be a fairly successful businessman. And he says that I cannot succeed in a larger city because I don't have this very supportive network in another place, and I don't need to take those risks because I've already achieved the successes that I had to by staying here and leveraging the connections here. Hari talks about how the city is only a place to work. शहर मात्र काम का स्रोत है, घाटे का सौदा है. So living in the city is a losing proposition because it's not clean, it's expensive, and I need to be home in the village. So he's opting to be a commuter so that he can, in his he can continue to stay in the village and support his family and pick up, help with farm work, while he is also being able to do non-farm work. So here the small city has a very particular positioning in terms of its geographical situation as easily accessible from the rural hinterland. And we see this a lot, both in Kishangarh as well as in Mangalore, though in Mangalore, it's more a small town to Mangalore kind of a relationship with very, very, very good transportation networks that allow you to do that, very good bus systems that allow you to do that, even daily or weekly commuting. In Kishangarh also, the whether it's good highways and sort of loans that allow you to pick up motorcycles, or whether it's the expansion of the railway station and therefore better sort of rail infrastructure. There's definitely the role of, and Sai Balakrishnan sort of picks up on this on her work when she talks about the role of highway-led development and the opportunities it creates for people with, of course, different castes. She talks about the caste differentials. And then our original sort of hypothesis of the city as a junction or a way station, we didn't find a lot of that. It's not like that was the predominant way in which the city was seen, but we definitely did see people. And this is where the individual personalities and individual ambitions sort of really come to fore, where people actually come to these cities. Mangalore has a bit of this story happening where it is the place of aspiration, and it is seen as sort of a place to a brighter future, because it's a place of encounter. Basically, a lot of people from different parts of the country are coming to Mangalore to work. A lot of people from different parts of Karnataka are coming to work. People are coming to study. They're coming to work in the SEZ. So different kinds of people also. And all of this creates a kind of mix that then allows you to hear stories about other places. So in this case of Satish, he's working in a hotel, and he makes friends who are now going to Dubai for higher wages. And this, as I told you, is a big story in Mangalore, and he's now negotiating this move to Dubai. This has, of course, the pandemic has put a spanner in his works, as it has for many of us. But he's also talking about how I make friends easily, and since I've done this through friends, when I go to Dubai, I can make friends there, and I can make a move on further, and I want to go and live in Australia. So this is a place where he hears these stories about people who've done these very ambitious moves, and he's a son of a poultry farmer. His father works in a poultry farm. His mother is a beedi worker. He comes from rural Maharashtra, somewhere near Aurangabad, but he doesn't consider that rural background as any kind of a barrier for him to move forward. So that's where, why youth and mobile aspirations becomes sort of an interesting disruptor in all of the stuff that we already know about cities and how caste and how identity in different ways becomes a mediator for your future. Then there's also the story of return migration, especially, and here I'd like to bring up, when the state actually puts, there are a number of enabling institutions, as you'll see in these stories, which are helping. So whether the enabling institution in the case of Vivek is a caste-based sort of very strong association on, an actual organized setup of gens in Kishangarh, which takes on poorer relatives and encourages them. In this case, it's a center for entrepreneurship that's set up by the district administration, which is actually attracted a group of people who are working abroad to come back to Mangalore, and they're given the subsidized space so that they can create more jobs and establish these creative businesses in the city. It's part of Mangalore's sort of bid to reposition itself in the new economy, and this is sort of linking back to the restructuring literature that where I'm positioning these cities, which Click Schiller and a whole bunch of people who look at neoliberal restructuring talk about how cities are repositioning themselves, constantly trying to move up the value chain, trying to have better, stronger global linkages, etc. So Mangalore fancies itself at that position. I can't say it's very successful. It's always being compared and comparing itself to a Bangalore, because of which it's trying IT, it's trying all sorts of things which don't necessarily work in a place like this. But these kind of enabling institutions do make a difference. And then there is in Mangalore also the story of unions. So there is a culture of collectivization. We did see that the Labor Department and the district administration there is very, sort of very supportive of these collectives. They are able to make certain claims, whether they are dock workers. So basically just head load carriers on the dock, they are organized and they can come and make certain kinds of claims for space, for instance, for separate private toilets for women, because a lot of women are involved in fish selling and fish cleaning and the fishery activity in Mangalore. Similarly, domestic workers are organized, transgender sex workers are organized. They migrated here from smaller towns in Karnataka, and here their collectives essentially negotiate protection from the police, because as I said before, it is a fairly conservative city and there can be a lot of backlash on groups like this. And in Mangalore, there is this constant, because there's a communal character, there is this constant atmosphere of insecurity and fear, and both men and women have to constantly negotiate this issue. So in a city which is aspiring, this move up the value chain and bringing in of tourism and education and hospitality and retail, and yes, these new sectors are beginning to provide a lot of employment, there is this constant other where it is still constrained by ideas which are very conservative, by social structures which imagine a lot, which impose a lot of restrictions on the movement of people and on the behavior of people. So I'll wrap up, because I think there are a lot of different parts that of this presentation, and different people in the audience may get struck by different angles. So I'll leave space for discussion. But essentially, my question is, to what extent do these small cities act as action spaces for youth? So if that's how we are sort of thinking about them, do they, don't they, in what way do they do it, and what's stopping them from really being these vibrant spaces where young people can go and reshape their lives? So clearly, they're important spaces because costs of migrating to metropolitan cities are high. Opportunities there also are very, have a higher bar. You may need higher skills. You may need very strong social networks to enter a Mumbai or a Delhi, whereas you can go to your district headquarter and try your luck out, because you always have, you can afford to fail, basically. There's that, you can take that risk and come back home if it doesn't work. On the other hand, opportunities are limited. Similarly, they do offer some anonymity, but they don't grant freedoms as such. So freedom is contingent on too many things in a city, in these kind of cities. Local conditions matter a lot, whether it's patriarchal norms and how they play out. So you may have got the sense that in Mangalore, women have a lot more freedom. You see a lot of women in public life, and though there is a difference between, say, women from conservative Muslim groups in the city compared to women from upper caste Hindu family, but in general, this public space is much more welcoming of women. So you'll see women working in retail jobs and secretarial jobs. You'll see them manning hotel receptions, etc., which you will not see in Kishangarh at all. So there is that regional sort of forms of patriarchy and how they affect the lives of women. Even how the residential neighborhoods, whether they are segregated neighborhoods, mixed neighborhoods. So for example, in Kishangarh, a woman may say that it's very safe. And then when you dig, you realize that she's talking about a mohalla and not about her city. So the safety sort of ends at the borders of her own mohalla, because her mohalla is a mohalla of a particular caste and a particular community where everybody knows everybody. So the safety is guaranteed by those kind of factors. But minute you step outside the mohalla, you cannot make that statement anymore. Then there are enabling institutions and systems which, and this is more of a policy point in terms of what do we, or a governance point rather, in terms of, they're there, but do they need to be strengthened? Are they good enough? Are they accessible to everybody, or are they only accessible to certain kinds of folks, like in the case of the caste mediated institutions? And mobility is used in a very particular way by young people. They use it to enter, but they also use it to exit from risky situations. They use mobility very strategically, knowing the limits. For example, like in the case of Rakesh, he's saying other people have gone and faced this kind of failure, and I'm not going to spend my family's hard-earned money if that's going to be my experience. I'm not even going to try. to migrate. And of course, that's very sad, because it speaks of a particular kind of, an extent of disheartenment that a Valmiki person would feel. But at the same time, it's for me, it's interesting to say that sort of communication and that thinking has happened to weigh your risks in a very, in a pro, and see your pros and cons, and you're able to articulate it in that particular way. So essentially, these tactics of negotiation are also gendered. So we found that a lot of the women, usually their sphere of influence is within the household, and there are many, many more stories. I've just picked a few to highlight here. So they are negotiating with their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, their mothers-in-law, and their fights are literally about personal mobility and those kind of agencies. But they do manage within those to push forward and to make certain kinds of arguments and get not just freedoms, but also employment opportunities and opportunities to study and make something of themselves. Whereas men tend to deal more directly with institutions and systems. So that's sort of the difference that I've really found in my work, which I'm pushing a little bit more in my PhD work. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing. And if you need me to bring the presentation back at some point, I can do that. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. We are now open for questions. If anybody has a question, they can go ahead. You can raise your hand and you can go ahead with the questions.
Oh, no?
No, seems empty. No.
Yeah, there's always a few minutes before.
That's okay. It was a lot. I think it takes time to sink in. It's also two different cities, and you may, if you're not familiar with the context, I tried to offer some context, but I mean, I was in and out of these places for 3 years before I could even begin to understand them. So I cannot hope that you will, I've lived and breathed Kishangarh and Mangalore. You haven't, so that's fine.
I think in case there's no one as yet, I'll probably say something. First of all, I loved the presentation, and I think it was the research was very interesting. Also because I myself worked mostly only in smaller cities in Punjab, and so a lot of the things that you were talking about seemed very familiar to me. And they do relate to the lived experience of people on an everyday basis, but I think they also relate to policy making and some of the problems that we face as policymakers and even politicians face as policymakers. So number one, I think so there was a point that Mukta ji you made about cities as this space where rural development and etc. can take place, and you said that is probably a separate discussion. Number one, I would love to have that discussion at some point of time whenever you do have that kind of time, because you said that it deals with policy level issues, but I think that's sort of the bread and butter here. So that would be lovely to deal with. The idea of the city as this place, where you jump from one place to the next to maybe the next. I think that was a very interesting concept for me because I've always thought of the work that we are doing in Abohar, and I've always thought that what will become of this city 25, 30 years from now. And what is happening right now is exactly as you said, people are moving out, and then there are some people who are moving in from other so from the peri-urban area or from the rural areas. So, if there's a locality which is today an elite locality, so-called, and someone might want to live there, but only if someone sells a house does someone else get a chance to sort of move in. And I've seen a lot of that happening. And so that the idea that these cities are not really places where one community or one kind of people are going to live forever, but also that people are going to, keep sort of migrating, and that's the human story essentially. I think that's a really interesting concept, and with that concept, I think the small city narrative totally changes, because suddenly now you don't want to plan it for, as you said, Mangalore doesn't have to be Bangalore, right? And Abohar, for example, doesn't have to be Bathinda, or Abohar doesn't have to be Ludhiana or Chandigarh, and neither can it be. Abohar has to be Abohar, and I think that's the uh, I think the point that we're trying to drive home as far as the entire conversation is concerned. The easy accessibility from the villages, and the fact there are other factors also that I felt affect that. For example, the kind of shops that are available in a small town are very different from the kind of shops that may be available in a larger town. So if I'm living in Delhi and I want to buy agricultural implements, I might not even ever get to that place. But in Abohar, for example, or in Mansa, where I earlier worked, or in Bathinda, it would be very common to come across a shop which is selling those kind of things. And what also drives that is the fact that the rents here are lesser, things are more informal, and lesser rents. So giving you another example, a lot of kids in Punjab want to move out to Canada, for example. And now, if you're from a family which can't afford for you to get an IELTS education in Chandigarh, because Chandigarh, the rents will be higher, the teachers will be paid more. So an IELTS course in Chandigarh might cost ₹1,00,000, whereas the same course in Abohar might cost you 30,000 rupees, because basically the rents are lower, the economy is more sort of informal. You're very likely to be able to get a teacher at a lesser salary, and the women particularly will be able to negotiate going to that IELTS center more easily compared to, as you said, going to Chandigarh or to Delhi to get that same education. So that also, I think the paradigm is really nice, because it changes the way someone like me looks at how a city should work. A couple of things that I'd want to throw to the house for discussion about small cities, and particularly I would want you also to maybe talk about it, Muktaji, is that what I'm seeing across India is this sort of uniformization of the cityscape. And particularly in cities which are supposed to be very well done. I very recently visited Indore, and it just looked like a very neat and clean version of Ludhiana to me. I mean, there was nothing particularly striking about the city as such. Whereas Bhopal, which is a smaller city, which is more sort of rooted in the culture that it has, seemed like a city, which is unto itself. So I wouldn't be able to make a very big comparison between Jalandhar or Ludhiana or maybe Mangalore or Indore or stuff like that, because there's this consistent theme of ke haan, itni chaudi sadkein bana do, aise kar do, the same brands, the same sort of style of urban development that we are seeing. And I think what we can sort of drive home by this Shehar series is also this, maybe, when we are doing the planning, maybe bringing in a bit of what the city is, and uska jo apna ek color hai, apna ek flavor hai, bringing that forward in the urban development that we are trying to do. So with that sort of question, and with the request of doing the rural development thing, I think these are points that are really relevant. Last thing that I'd want to tell you is that very recently, when the last government was formed in Punjab, the biggest issue was jobs. And that issue of jobs is not an issue of Chandigarh. It was not an issue of Ludhiana. Even in Chandigarh, nobody can get a job. I can live with my parents only because I'm in the service and the headquarters are in Chandigarh. All of my friends have moved out. And but there's no hue and cry about it. Whereas in these smaller towns, there's this huge sort of hue and cry, as you said, about कि जी बंदे ने पोस्ट ग्रेजुएशन कर लिया है पर जॉब उसे झाड़ू मारने की मिल रही है, which is very common. I have around 20-30 people sweeping streets for us in my own team who are postgraduates. And हुआ क्या था कि right before the last election, actually, there was this program that was launched by the government called the Ghar Ghar Rozgar Yojana by the Congress party, and then they came into power. And so then that became the sort of most important pillar of governance that was put forward to people. And the idea in that Ghar Ghar Rozgar Yojana was कि चलो जी हम एक employment bureau बनाएंगे and we'll connect these boys and girls to jobs in larger areas. But again and again, as we interacted with those people, what was thrown at us was कि जी हमारी यहाँ पे भी है 4-5 बीघे जमीन और यहाँ पे भी हम 8-10 हजार रुपये यहाँ से आ जाता है घर को, हमें तो आसपास अगर जॉब मिल जाए जिसमें 8-10 हजार रुपया और आ जाए तो हमें उसकी जरूरत है। हम यहाँ से अगर लुधियाना चले जाएंगे तो हमारे पशु कौन देखेगा, हमारी मतलब हमारे घर को कौन देखेगा, हमारे खेत को कौन देखेगा, बच्चे कहाँ पे पढ़ेंगे, गांव का स्कूल तो बेटर है पर लुधियाना में तो हमारे को बस्ती में जाके रहना पड़ेगा, वहां पे लेट से यूपी बिहार से लोग आते हैं, उनके साथ तो हमारी बनेगी नहीं, you know, stuff like that. So again and again the trend was that people wanted jobs here, and so that they could supplement their incomes a little bit and aspire to live a better life. Whereas what the government really could offer was jobs in larger centers. And I think so the idea of developing smaller cities and this so-called demographic dividend, or if you want to call it a demographic, I don't know, outburst, destruction, confusion, whatever you want to call it, I think that and its relationship with the small city is very important. And it's very nice that you pointed it out, but I think we need to think much more about this and maybe reach to a conclusion and then plan our policies accordingly. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll respond quickly, and meanwhile, other folks can have think of whatever else they want to ask. So I think it's also interesting that you said that somebody is accessing an IELTS course because they want to go to Canada. So there's also this question of jumping skills, that it doesn't have to be step by step by step. You can actually jump from a small city to an international destination. So it's, I mean, that just this is more of a academic point, but we often think of these things as very sequential, but they need not be sequential in the lives of people. So that's also something that we have to see, which is in the context of that place. The second point on uniformization of the cityscape is a very interesting actually conversation. And here too, I mean, there's a lot of literature in in America and Europe on medium size and small cities, where there is actually this whole thing of branding and identity of a city, and the idea, and that's why tourism became part of this new economy setup, because the tourism was the only way, and Rajasthan has done it successfully to some extent, where you could capitalize the locality of a place and still be part of the global capital economy. So you're stuck with that one thing, and now COVID has happened and there's no other way to really do this. So I mean, there's art and craft, there's tourism, there's very limited ways in which this can happen, but it does not seem like there's a way of thinking where you say that doing things in the local way is not about attracting other people who will value this and pay for it, but could actually be just a simpler way to do whatever we are doing anyway. In the sense that in Mangalore, this was very much part of the conversation, where there were two factions, because like everywhere else, there's a very very influential lobby of developers who obviously want to make big developments where they can sell large amount of square feet. And to make big developments, you want a car-led economy. To have a car-led economy, you need roads of a certain width, you need parking. So all that is locked into a particular kind of cityscape. And then you had the counter where people were saying that there is an old city and there's a ecological and a sustainability conversation, there's a traditions conversation, there's a certain quaintness to the old city, and why can't we maintain that? And eventually they actually proposed the development of the older city as part of their smart city plan, and then it ends up being like a gentrification of the smaller city, of the inner city. So you can't win this really. Either you are Disneyfying it, turning it into something attractive for outsiders to come and pay value for, or you are doing some infrastructure improvements without the wide roads and stuff, but eventually you're ending up actually displacing people who are living there themselves. And I think we need to think a lot harder about whether there are other ways to do this. There aren't really very easy answers, though I agree that small cities have better opportunities or are better positioned to do this definitely than metropolitan areas, or even cities like Indore, which are already, I think, across that stage where they can actually, they can't backtrack. They've already set themselves on a particular kind of track. And on the rural development angle and on the jobs angle, I think again there is that imagination of a particular kind of job. The informal, and here I think we should be cautious, because when we say that small cities are very informal, we also mean that there is a very specific political economy that is at work there, in which doing a very formal intervention is much harder than doing a formal intervention in a larger city where there is already some level of formalization. So you're building on top of that formalization. So that's really, I think, the issue of whether you are able to successfully work with local elites and local politicians to create jobs, but keep them happy as well, because really that's really the crux of it. It's not about bringing in a model from somewhere else which will create like factory le aao kahin se aur usko wahan pe dal do. That's really not what's going to work. It has to be contextual. In Kishangarh, I kept asking what happens when there's no marble, what happens, because it's such a resource dependent industry, but there was nahi patthar hi hoga. Meaning, it was really astonishing to me that even very, very intelligent people could not think beyond that particular industry. And maybe that's the nature of how small cities work. Before marble, they had power loom. And before that, they had textile. And before that, they had art and craft. And the city has grown a little bit more with every industry in terms of size and in terms of economy. But I think that's also part of the ethos of a small city, that at that particular point of time, they can only think of this one thing, and everything sort of only links around that. Diversification is not the way a small city thinks. So should they not? If they think about diversity, will that change the nature of the city itself? Will local elites be interested in that kind of diversification? So in Kishangarh, our survey data actually shows us that employment is not on marble. When you go to Kishangarh, all you see is marble. But the employment is coming from hospitality, construction, transport, which are all supportive sectors to marble. But so it's actually quite a diverse economy, but that's not what the imagination of the people there is. वो कहते हैं यहाँ सब marble में काम करते हैं. Everybody does पत्थर का काम, but actually only 25% of the workforce does पत्थर का काम. So these kind of, even bringing data to the ground at the local level, the Nagar Panchayat had no access to this kind of data. When we went and shared the survey findings, they were taken aback by this. Because there's no granular data. Your PLFS or something, whatever is happening, how much of the sample would be there in that city? Nothing. So state governments are also not really doing citywide surveys. You don't have that kind of information available to you to make those decisions. So there are some fundamental, I think, problems that we need to bring to the table. We don't have enough information to really be able to think these things through well in these places.
So Shilpa would like to ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much, Mukta, for a wonderful presentation. When you were sort of on the slide of Kishangarh's context, all of us here could relate to Abohar's context a lot. Then how Powerloom was at one point of time was the core economic activity in the city. But with partition happening and with changing in the ecological condition of this area, the cotton industry sort of declined, and now Kinnu is one of the major economic feed there. But like you said right now, that the diversity which is there but is not visible to people on the ground is similar in Abohar as well. I wanted to ask you, like Kishangarh, even after the decline of the power loom, it is picking up with the industrialization, maybe in the marble sector. Though it's at a very raw stage in terms of it's just cutting and dealing with marble in that manner. In that scenario, how does Kishangarh's regional location is helping it grow? Because I think in that sense, Abohar, what maybe it's my observation by talking to people there, it's also struggling a bit being away from Chandigarh, being towards the away, like totally away from the major cities of Punjab and towards the end of Punjab. So I wanted to ask you on that, how the regional location of Kishangarh sort of helped it.
Right. So actually, it's interesting because there are no quarries around Kishangarh. The nearest quarry is at least 100 kilometers away. So this is not a question of extraction ho raha hai aur wahi pe aapne factory laga diya. This is not the story there. There was a marble quarry many years ago, which was the Makrana marbles, which is what we used to study. And at that time, all marble used to come from Makrana in the 80s, and I think even up to the early 90s. But then that quarry, ran out and it got shut. So the nearest quarries are in are in Udaipur district, basically. They're near Udaipur. And it's very interesting because basically it is the blocks are coming in from somewhere, getting processed here, and then the processed material is going out. So it's a cluster story. It's about creating a large number of units in one place and the kind of efficiencies that come from that. So that's one thing. Second, it's a branding story. So it's RK Marbles, which makes marble synonymous with RK in the North India region, right? Third, it's a business connection story. So these are Jains, Marwadis, Maheshwaris, all business communities who have very strong social networks in Bombay. I mean, Ambanis go there to shop for marble. They go there themselves. And they will tell you that when you go to Kishangarh. So that branding positioning of yourself as a place that can supply marble to the richest person in the country is the kind of positioning that they're building. And it also helped them. And it's not coincidental that this set of business people has lobbied for the transportation infrastructure. There's a political, they have made their political claim and worked on that for years and years and years. It's the Kishangarh Marble Association that decides who will get elected from there, who would be the local MLA. The people are told that this, because they have the airport for Ajmer is actually in Kishangarh. The Kishangarh is on the freight corridor. Adani Logistics Park is in Kishangarh. Highway development projects are in Kishangarh. RICO has 5 industrial phases in Kishangarh. No, and when we talk to the administration in Ajmer, they are like, we are the district headquarters, but all the jobs are being created in Kishangarh. And we are, so it's a sort of an upside down power relationship situation, which has all been created by local elites, but they're still a Nagar Panchayat. They don't even have a corporation. So look at where the state or where the elected state government is in all of this. It's not even a district headquarters. So वहाँ पे तहसील level के officials बैठते हैं from the state government. So lots of things like that. Very interesting. It's basically almost like a different form of a private city in some ways. Where your hospital is run by the private sector, your school is run by the private sector. And yet there is a government machinery also in operation because it's a tehsil headquarter. So I think that's why I meant that there are small cities are interesting because in a sense it's hard to generalize. Like all of you felt that there were certain things that sounded very familiar. But when you dig in, there are very, very specific contextual things which you need to cater for. So it's a struggle, can you really tell? And that's what the whole ordinary city that Jennifer Robinson talks about is, that there is all this diversity and all this specificity that we need to take into account. And that ordinariness is actually very special, but it's also very ordinary. So how do you deal with all of that? And when you're talking about, at intervention at a local scale, of course, all the specificity in the world is what you need. But when you're talking about urban theory, or you're talking about putting it into a regional system or understanding it in the context of the region, then, so it depends on which scale you're thinking at, whether the specificity is what you need to pay attention to, or the generalization is what you need to. That's how I conceptualize it, at least.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mukta. Just a question, like post-COVID or during COVID, how, because I mean, we've all heard about, the migration and the reverse migration, all that, but it's also interesting how a lot of mobilization has happened because of COVID. Like within, like we were looking at Abohar, there was this organization, Robin Hood Army, who really got active during COVID. They were like reaching out to people, they were serving food, they were, so there were a lot of interesting movement that has happened. So if you can talk about like your observations in the context of the cities that you work in.
To be honest, I haven't done a lot of field work during and after COVID in these places, so I only know of accounts through my interlocutors. What I understand is that in terms of reverse migration or in terms of what happened to migrants, Kishangarh was very badly hit, but because the marble industry was also badly hit starting GST. So like all other SME sectors, there was this, demonetization, GST, COVID sort of came in a tuck kind of a way, which actually in some strange ways made them dependent on migrant labor in peculiar ways. But the extent of migration, the number of people coming in reduced because some units became sick, and so all of those kind of things. And the bargaining power of the workers is not very high, so they were coming in despite the bad situation, but working for lower wages and those kind of things. So from a labor perspective, it was a reduction, a shrinking, and a a worse deal for them. Mangalore actually it doesn't seem, they did see, during that exodus time, there was a lot in Mangalore also happening. So it's large enough for those kind of stories to really, to have emerged, and where people were trying to walk home. And again, like you were saying, immense mobilization, local mobilization of NGOs and other kinds of support groups to collect money, to help them find transportation and all of those things. But it's also bounced back a little bit faster. Not construction so much. Real estate had already slowed, but other things have, because it's a very service sort of economy. So things have bounced back a little bit after Mangalore. It also, a lot of the fisheries and a lot of the cashew processing and those kind of fields are dependent on labor from other parts of Karnataka who could come back quite fast after COVID. So it's really, even interstate migrant workers, again, because of unionization, collectivization, they had savings schemes, they had some sort of cushions, not the ones who were seasonal migrants and coming through contractors and sort of construction workers kind of people, because they were only there for 3-4 months, 5 months at a time, but the ones who are a little bit more stable actually had quite a bit of cushion in Mangalore, is what I understand from conversations.
This is sort of the last call for anybody who wants to ask a question, can raise their hand. We're running out of time now.
Kanchan.
Kanchan?
Kanchan and Richa.
Kanchan, you can ask the question.
And me.
Okay. So quick question, Mukta. See, in the case of small cities where I have visited, and in Abohar, I saw that the political relations and the political class is very oppressive. Like, the people have this general fear of the political class, and it's like the relations are very oppressive. So what kind of differences did you find in the two cities where, like, in the north and the south context, how important was the political class or even the capitalists in kind of power hierarchies?
Very, very important. I mean, even though Mangalore, I told the story of Kishangarh a little bit more, but even in Mangalore, which is 500,000 people, local elites and local politicians are extremely powerful. Builders are extremely powerful, and they have very strong, basically there would be a situation in which a bureaucrat would ask the local whoever it is. There was this very interesting person in Mangalore who is a builder and who basically runs the corporation from his office. And it's a, it's not an unusual situation at all, but we couldn't get anything out of the municipal commissioner because he felt that he had to ask this person for permission before giving us the go ahead to do a survey, before issuing the letter. So we had to actually go back channel and say, listen, please give the go ahead. And then we were given this offer: I'll set up the office for you, I'll sponsor your survey, you come here and you do the survey. And we had to very politely say no, because we're not going to let you tell us what to write in our report. And it was a very difficult conversation for us because the bureaucratic class was totally subservient to the local politics. So this is not a small city story necessarily. I mean, we see this in larger cities as well. It's much starker in a small city context. I mean, as in the local politicians probably have less competition as compared to a larger city. That's one way to explain it at least.
Go ahead, Richa, go ahead.
Pura, you can go ahead. Richa can ask the last question.
Also, Shailja wants to ask the question. So. Okay, so actually there's the framing of action spaces or like enabling institutions, all of these things, like Shilpa's already said, like we're already buzzing with, what this means when we think about Abohar. Even the, what you said about there being economic activities or like the workforce actually being quite diversified, but the imagination of the city or what, that what we're hearing is still very limited. But when we actually experience the city, like we're seeing a lot of different groups, some of these being like really small units and clusters that have, established themselves. We've seen jutti making quite a bit, which, when you ask on the street, people are like, hoti hai, but it's, somewhere and maybe not so important, but we're experiencing that very differently. So, I mean, what I'm wondering is, so, I mean, how are you thinking about, so there are all these very, very specific things. What are the things that you're actually thinking in terms of even regionally? Because we're thinking about Punjab and we're thinking about other small cities in Punjab. How do you start moving from these kind of framings into what can actually be proposed here? Because, I mean, we've seen even these things that you're saying about the political class being so strong. I mean, we've seen a lot of this. In Abohar, we're seeing enabling institutions to be NGOs. I don't know if that's, how that plays out, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in Kishangarh, there are hardly any. I mean, the NGOs that are there are very much the kind of NGOs that are extensions of the state and basically delivering state schemes to the people. They're not NGOs. There are actually our partners in Kishangarh were actually a rural NGO because there is Tilonia and, the barefoot movement and all that is all in the vicinity. So, I mean, MKSS, Rajasthan is an NGO. Like it's teeming with NGOs. So it's not hard to find an NGO in Rajasthan, but they're all rural. So that was an interesting thing where you don't find any local partner in a small city. And then we had some connections and we connected with this NGO and they actually jumped up and down and said, we want to work in the small city. And we were like, why? And their articulation was, it's too intertwined. कि शहरीकरण समझे बिना हम अपने गांव को नहीं समझ सकते वो दिन गए. I mean, so that articulation for me was very, very, it was very affirming because that's the framing that we were going in with, that these are very entangled spaces. And we are used to thinking of them from a very, we will think of urban and rural in different buckets. So the whole project took off in a very different way in Kishangarh because our base was Kotri. Our base was not Kishangarh. So that but not that answers your question. I don't know. I mean, this business of multiple diverse activities or niches or what story you want to, who wants to tell what story about the city? Who gets to tell the story about the city? That's a power question, right? Who Abohar की कहानी कौन सुनाता है? लोकल एमएलए सुनाता है, लोकल बिजनेसमैन सुनाता है, या एक्चुअली कोई सिटीजन नैरेटिव है भी? Because somebody tells the story and then that story just keeps getting repeated over and over. So there's no space for an alternate or a subaltern telling of that story. That space can only come when there is a collectivity of the subaltern, and in such a small place, that's really hard to do because you're being pushed back in a very real, you're experiencing the pushback in a very, maybe even in a violent and in a very stark sort of a way. In larger cities, it's different. You can collectivize and you can collect a lot of people who are saying things that maybe the powers that we don't like very much. But since it's a democracy and since you have to appear like you're giving people space, you let them say something. But in a small place, it's easy to marginalize, it's easy to not let these voices come forward. So it's really about whether those NGOs are invested in telling an alternate story. Is that even part of what they want to do? Or is it a very development kind of narrative कि हम ये स्कीम ज्यादा अच्छे से implement कर देंगे या child marriage रुकवा देंगे? Big narrative in Rajasthan is this. You know, we've been working for 10 years, the child marriage rate has come down. Great, you've achieved that success, but there is no desire to tell the story of that place. It's a very intervention project kind of language that you're getting even from the NGOs. So the enabling institution is also stuck in that state's language of scheme and project, and you know, so for me it's like it's more questions of that are you now talking to me as a resident of this city and as having a stake in this city, or are you talking to me as an NGO worker who gets a salary check at the end of the month?
Mukta, just interjecting to this argument is like, I mean, of course, there are, like you're saying there are certain stories that are doing the rounds, but there are also maybe some alternative stories which are there at a certain scale that we don't, that are not coming out, but they're there. You know, there's some seed of it, or there's some basis of it is there, and they come out, you know, unexpectedly sometimes. You know, like in Chandigarh, we suddenly started seeing, you know, these public spaces that are being claimed by these street dancers who are from working class neighborhoods. You know, they would come with a music box and they'll just start performing, you know, and it's like in Sector 17, or, you know, like, I was also wondering, you know, if those kind of spaces are also virtual, and are there any studies or any kind of observations that you made, like what's happening in the virtual space?
In Mangalore, a little bit more, because it's a larger city. It's got some sort of, it's a rich city compared to Kishangarh. It's overall has a better, I mean, a more higher prosperity levels, but it's diverse in a different way. It's diverse in the sense of different kind of religions. Like you have like a big Catholic population, a big Muslim population, even among Hindus, lot of caste, differentials, lot of different powerful communities. So there are multiple stories. There isn't one story. Nobody can tell one story. So there are definitely competing narratives there. And there is this, again, narrative of the Hindu right, which is very strong in Mangalore. In all of Dakshin Kannada and Udupi, you see, you know, that as a big narrative that has emerged. And in fact, we had this bizarre experience of collecting our data during election time. So it was, you know, we had to really be very careful about where we're doing surveys when and who we are accosting, and literally like come back out of streets because from the other side some rally was coming, and you know, things like that, fun things like that were happening. So virtual spaces perhaps do exist. I don't know whether they are telling something very different or very alternate, or whether they're reproducing the stories that you're hearing in the non-virtual spaces. I can't really speak to that. We actually did a film, and we showed that film back in colleges in Mangalore. And that really got people to, kids, especially college kids, college teachers, to talk a lot and reflect a lot about why they were here. And that's when all these stories about safety and about fear and about all of these things actually came out. They didn't come out when we did our first round of interviews and interactions. Everybody told us the good stories in the first rounds. It's when the film went on and they were able to, that triggered things like, you know, I'm from Bombay and my parents have sent me to Mangalore here because my grandmother lives here, and Mangalore has this reputation for getting very good, very high percentages. Basically, it's a pre-university college town. Karnataka has all these towns which do this, right? You go for 11th and 12th, and then you come with these 100%, and so you get into these whatever competitions and universities and stuff like that. And you know, her obviously she's coming from Bombay, and she's like thinking, why am I stuck here for 2 years? So it was a totally different narrative. So because I'm looking at it from a migration lens, a lot of the narratives are also coming from people who don't necessarily think of that city all of the time, but are talking about it only from their temporal experience, like whatever they are feeling at for whatever period of time they're there. It's not necessarily long time residents that you're talking to. So there's also that mix in my sample, which can confuse this conversation about belonging or who's telling the story, or whether there are multiple stories.
Not really a question, just an observation among all the youth. So since COVID happened, like before COVID, the mobility was a lot like according to the opportunities for the youth. So where there is an opportunity of job and etc. So since COVID happened, a lot of things has turned to virtual, like work from home, etc., etc. So a lot of them are now going back to their homes because it's comfortable there. They don't have to pay rents, and it's much cheaper there. So it's easier to save there. So this whole migration and aspiration thing is changing also, since they are able to work from home, work from anywhere. Now it has become work from anywhere. So all the aspirations, like they are going to their dream, like wherever they like to be. So it's also about experience. So not really based on the job opportunities, but many more factors coming, and most of them are expecting that it will become like a long-term thing or a permanent thing, because many companies are doing that, planning to turn virtual or things like this. So this opposite thing is happening, and aspirations and direction is changing. It's very interesting.
So interestingly, in Kishangarh, a lot of the women I spoke to were already doing a lot of this gig-based work. They were already into this business of घर पे कुछ बना लेंगे, online platform, Facebook से बेचेंगे, WhatsApp से बेचेंगे, before COVID. I mean, not talking about any COVID being anywhere near the scene, because they had mobility restrictions, right? They had all this respectability stuff that they had to constantly live up to, and that's the way they found out of it. And if you talk to edtech platforms in North India, they'll tell you that the bulk of our teachers come from Rajasthan, because for a very long time they've been using these work from home, work from anywhere strategies. So it's interesting. And also I think a lot of, at least I think I would wait and watch. I think things will, whatever we are seeing in Europe and the US, 1 year ago they were saying exactly the same things, and now young people are leaving with a vengeance. So there is a combination of real estate prices and rental affordabilities in the cities, wherever they were working, whether they want freedoms. Not everybody is happy staying with their families and working. There is an end to that honeymoon period of your mother feeding you and all of that. So I would wait and watch. I don't think it's as permanent a shift as we think it is what I'm saying. So let's see. 1 year from now, we'll be maybe talking about how we don't have enough supply of PG accommodations in large cities.
Sheldon.
Hi, Mukta. I hope it's last question.
Sure.
You talked about like Kishangarh is it's like declining in its growth, and people are unable to think of anything after marble. What could be the next alternative? So if we see before marble, there were other things as well you talked about. So is there any connection between that thing and like migration? People migrated somewhere for a particular activity, and they returned back, and that thing had had put on, it had eventually another, like कि एक growth का एक और नया aspect, like मार्बल के बाद कि अब ये लोग इस चीज के लिए बाहर जा रहे थे और रिटर्न करे. आफ्टर दैट the city has another aspect to build its economy on. So is there any link between that thing? So if we means like if we study the migration pattern and we could think of what could be the next economic alternative for the city to stop its declining growth, basically, is it like, is there any connection or so?
So it's definitely taken a hit, but I don't think it's ready to declare itself as declining yet. It's still with reinventing within the stone space. So you see a lot more granite cutters going up, marble cutters कम हो गए हैं, नए machines आके replace कर जाते हैं. So and also very interesting, in Andhra Pradesh they discovered, they came across, they prospected a whole new bunch of mines, of stone mines. So you have a knowledge exchange story. So you have stories of joint ventures in Andhra Pradesh, which are joint ventures with investment from local elites in Kishangarh, and all the machine operators in Andhra Pradesh are from Kishangarh. And then they're training the local workforce there. So yeah, I mean, Kishangarh's economy may not be growing, but the expertise developed in Kishangarh is helping economy somewhere else grow. So that mobility story is definitely there. Kishangarh does not know where it's going, but it's helping the rest of whatever grow. So there is all of that. There is that interesting story which I found really, you met people who've spent 3 months in some really obscure place in Andhra Pradesh, training the machine operators there. Then the same contractors are sourcing from Araria and Bihar and now sending that labor to Andhra Pradesh instead of getting them to Kishangarh. So it's the movement of capital and labor to another place, basically, with the same kind of logics.
So basically, out migration has figured out a few alternatives for them, for the either for other cities' economy they are building up.
Yeah, I don't even think they're cities. I think they're just these industrial clusters in the middle of nowhere in the case of Andhra, because power, and they're able to get power in non-urban kind of locations. So it's not even a city place where they are going now. It's just a bunch of cutting machines somewhere.
Thank you.
So Aboha Urban Studio would like to thank you for taking out time for this amazing interactive session. And with that, we would like to come to end of the session.
Say bye. Mukta, we would really like you to if you've seen in the series, the last presentation.
Yeah, is your own work. Yes, yeah. I'll definitely try and be there. I told Kanchan that I've marked my calendar.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being a very engaged and patient audience.
Thank you, Mukta. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye.